If you go to Barcelona, then you see the work of Gaudi. If you go to Chicago, you see the work of Frank Lloyd Wright. You know, they're identified with those cities. You make the pilgrimage. And many, many more people now are making the pilgrimage to go and see Mackintosh's work in context in Glasgow. He is one of the greatest, most innovative, most original, most exciting, most beautiful architects and designers of the 20th century.
We know what Victorian homes should look like. Clutter, heavy furnishings, sombre colours, blinds, double curtains, flock wallpaper, gas brackets, pot plants. These interiors were designed by a Victorian architect, Charles Rennie Mackintosh. Mackintosh saw things differently. He was a modern man, ahead of his time.
In 1900, his name was all over the world. Everybody knew the quality of his work. Then there was a long, long period when no one had any interest in Mackintosh at all. And now, as we approach the end of the 20th century, he's immensely famous again.
In the 1890s, Glasgow ranked 6th for size among European cities, including Vienna and St. Petersburg. 1 in 3 of the world's ships came from Clydeside yards. In 6 continents, people rode on Glasgow trains, Glasgow trams. But it was also the city that produced one of the world's greatest designers.
In 1896, he had this fantastic success. There was a competition to design new buildings for the Glasgow School of Art, which was in any way his kind of spiritual home. He was 28, and he built what is unquestionably his greatest building.
The site was inauspicious, on a steep hill, and the governors insisted that the school should be a plain building.
There's no doubt that when Mackintosh built the Glasgow School of Art, there was nothing like it, which is perhaps why it was such a shock to the people of Glasgow. The front of the building was maybe marginally acceptable, but the back, which is what most people could see perched up on the top of that hill, was a real shock. Bare, simple, austere, sculptural. We'd now call it perhaps even cubistic. Many architects and designers of the same period as Mackintosh were looking far away for inspiration, mostly to the south, to England, to France, to Germany, to Spain. Mackintosh looked in the opposite direction. He looked north, into the origins of his own country, into the medieval architecture, the architectural vernacular styles of his own Scotland.
Mackintosh combined architectural styles, playing games about the building. Elevated above the city's soot and smoke, a glimpse of nature, a dovecote with dummy entrances, nowhere for the birds to roost, and no means of leaving grain for them. Poetic, but impossible.
When I first walked into the Glasgow School of Art, I was overwhelmed, totally. It was one of the most exciting moments of my life. I'd read about it and seen it, and I was curious about it, but I didn't realize it would be such an exciting building. Each time I go in now, even at this time, I still have the same feeling. And I think one of the main reasons it feels that way to me, and I'm sure to others, is that it's a living building.
Since it was built, the Glasgow School of Art remains unchanged. Mackintosh designed absolutely everything to serve the artist, and it still does.
I think Mackintosh's library is rightly considered to be one of his finest works. It's a great dark jewel in his work. It's entirely original. It's a masterpiece of Mackintosh's originality, and yet you can see where it came from. There's a strong influence of his interest in Japan. There's a strong feeling of the kind of libraries that you would have found at monasteries or abbeys in Scotland, and yet he makes it something that is completely his own.
Like some giant storage container, the library is suspended from the ceiling of the room above on wrought iron brackets. The wooden posts stand on steel joists beneath the floor. The structure of the library is state-of-the-art, but the effect inside is like entering a forest, a timeless place. At the center, soft moonlight, and beyond that, the twinkling of stars. Nature is everywhere.
I suppose for me the thing that I love about Mackintosh interiors is that serenity, that calmness, that sense of light, the sort of elegance of a Japanese interior that makes it a very restful place to be. And of course, every tiny detail of it is so well thought out.
Seed, root, leaf, bud, bloom. Charles Rennie Mackintosh was born in 1868 in Glasgow. He was dyslexic and walked with a limp. Parents, stolid, upwardly mobile Presbyterians. His father, a Highlander in the police force, later superintendent. Aged 16, Mackintosh was articled to a firm of Glasgow architects. In the evenings, he attended classes at the Glasgow School of Art.
I think Mackintosh as a young man lived a kind of double life. There was a professional life that he lived in an architect's office, which was ordinary enough, though the office itself was distinguished. But then I think he had a strong sense of identity as an artist, of himself as an artist, combined with his professional role as an architect. This can be explained really neatly, because in 1893 he went to have his photograph taken very carefully, and the portrait shows him with an enormous floppy bow tie. He's posing there as an artist. It's very much how the artists of the 1890s would have looked, and this makes an amazing contrast with a photograph of him back in the office, where he wears the tight collar and the dark suit, just like a professional man. So the photograph is saying, I'm an artist, there's more to me than just an ordinary professional architect.
There was a vital role in the whole of the renaissance of the arts in Glasgow at the turn of the century played by Francis Newbery, who came up from London to Glasgow to take over as headmaster of the Glasgow School of Art. It was a daring appointment. This was a very young man. But he came from a London that was already full of arts and crafts. He knew most of the major figures in the movement in London. He knew about the integration of architecture and design and craft, and he brought that message to Glasgow. When he inserted that message into the teaching program at Glasgow School of Art, he found a remarkable group of men and women who were receptive to that idea, led, of course, by Charles Rennie Mackintosh and the group that became known as the Four, or the Spook School, as they were sometimes called.
The School of Art opened up a new world to Mackintosh. Here he met people with money and attitude, young Turks. During these years, one of his closest friends was Herbert McNair, a draftsman from the architect's office where Mackintosh worked. The two of them became part of a set, a group of talented women students who called themselves the Immortals. They were bohemians, free livers, idealists. At the weekend house parties, they argued over how best they might unleash beauty on the world. The group included Frances Macdonald and her older sister Margaret, both of whom already had their own design workshop. The sisters epitomized the aesthetic woman, art careerists. They were in no hurry to get married or to settle down. Margaret had copper hair and an eye for colourful clothes. She turned heads, including Mackintosh's.
The Mackintosh group were very interested in meaning. They thought that art should have a purpose. Mackintosh wrote that he did not want his art to be like an envelope without contents. And one work which demonstrates this is a work that Mackintosh did in 1896, which is called Part Seen, Imagined Part. And in this work, you see an image of a plant or a tree. And within this plant structure is a woman. It is, in fact, I think, Margaret. Mackintosh gave the painting to Margaret. And you have this movement from root, stem, flower, and then up into a spiritual zone where ideas and life seeds. And he's really saying to Margaret, you are my muse. Margaret, I've seen part of you. I would like to see all of you. When are you going to let me? And the top half of the painting is revealed and the bottom half is hidden. But he's also playing with the whole idea that art is about seeing, but it also always demands imagination of the viewer.
The work of the Immortals had a style of its own, which the critics lampooned. They were nicknamed the Spook School. They were controversial. The art school's credo was to take from nature, but this was nature with pagan overtones. Nature is endlessly fertile, and the symbolism speaks, inevitably, of the sexual. In the immortal's work, people and plants turn into one another with dreamy ease, sexually self-reproducing. We grow, like plants and trees, from the soil, and we mature into spiritual beings. Seed, root, leaf, bud, bloom.
Both Margaret Macdonald and Frances produced very sexual works. I think in many ways they, as women, were more bold than the men in this. And you can see in paintings like Margaret's Summer a wonderful sexuality. But it's not a crude sexuality, it's an ennobling love.
Art, Mackintosh wrote, art is the flower, life is the green leaf.
In 1891, when he first met Margaret Macdonald, who was to become his wife, he was already engaged to Jessie Keppie, who was his boss, John Keppie's youngest sister. It was no small thing to break an engagement in the late 19th century, especially in sort of high circles of upper middle class life, say in Glasgow. And so in addressing his future, Mackintosh had to do two things. How would he resolve his life as a man, and how would he shape his career as an artist-architect? And the strange thing is, I think that those two problems are resolved in one blow, you might say, and in one person. And that person was Margaret Macdonald. By choosing her, he courageously, though tragically, you might say, casts Jessie Keppie aside and risks expulsion from the firm within which he was working, and risks his place in Glasgow society, risks his career as a commercial architect in Glasgow, but he chooses the woman that he loves, and he chooses to work with new values to create a new art.
Mackintosh's years of study at the art school were as much a preparation for the buildings to come as his draftsman's toil in the offices of Honeyman and Keppie. He would be an artist-architect. Buildings, like art, should bring people to the light, providing a form of enlightenment to those who live or work in them. Buildings, he said, should celebrate joy in nature, grace of form, gladness of colour, the functional and the lyrical. In 1900, Mackintosh and Margaret Macdonald married. The question is often asked, who did what in this most equal of partnerships? Mackintosh signed his sketches with their two sets of initials. I had talent, Mackintosh was to say later. Margaret had genius. Mackintosh is admitting just how much courage his wife gave him to keep his head, not to toe that same line which the other Glasgow architects did.
That year, 1900, was, for Mackintosh, a complete annus mirabilis. He gets married in the summer, and then he doesn't have a honeymoon because he knows already when they're married that he's been invited to go to Vienna to install an exhibit there with the Vienna Secession organization, which is the progressive artists' movement in Vienna.
The Secession was a breakaway group of radical designers like Joseph Hoffmann, Koloman Moser and Gustav Klimt. Recognition from them would give Mackintosh the international profile he was looking for. Like Glasgow, taste was more severe in Vienna than in the centres of Art Nouveau like Paris and Brussels, and in tune with a Mackintosh's own. Strict geometry, organic botanical forms, overt sexuality and death. Vienna thrummed with inventiveness, with the continual shock of the new.
You know, Mackintosh came from a large family and had lots of brothers and sisters, but I think he also had a spiritual brother in Joseph Hoffmann in Vienna. And when the Viennese invited Mackintosh to go to Vienna and create an exhibition there, I think he thought it was perhaps the happiest time of his life. He was lionized and feted and really almost worshipped by these people, drawn through the streets in a flower-bedecked wagon by the students, singing his praises. It was quite a wonderful time for him because he brought a message to them. It was a message that was a prophecy, but I also think it was a kind of prescription, because what Mackintosh told them, what he said, what they heard, was an indication of how you could create what in German is called the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art, where furniture, carpets, lighting, the walls, everything you can think of in the domestic interior was joined together in a total work of art. They saw that in the example that Mackintosh brought from Glasgow. They saw how that could be created, and it was an absolute inspiration for the Viennese designers. They had a great banquet in Vienna, and the toast to him was, "To our master, Mackintosh, you who are the greatest since the Gothic." Hoffmann said, "To Mackintosh, our master, you who have shown us the way." Mackintosh's influence there was fantastic. What they did for him was to give him an enormous boost of confidence, so that when he went back to Glasgow, he began to produce some of the most exciting, the most innovative, the most confident work that he produced in his entire career.
Hoffmann's sketch for a high-backed chair. Mackintosh's ladder-back chair of the previous year. Perhaps the two men were just following two straight lines in parallel with one another, turning decorative motifs, lines and right angles, squares, into solid design. Mackintosh may have picked this up from the Viennese, or did he influence them? When they were in Vienna, Mackintosh was asked to provide a music room for the villa of a progressive-thinking businessman, Fritz Warndorfer, white on white, with a square-boxed piano designed by Mackintosh, and gesso panels by Margaret, small ones on the piano and vast ones between frieze rail and ceiling, illustrating princesses from a Metalink play.
Joseph Hoffmann and a small group of Viennese designers thought that they would create something that was rather like the arts and crafts guilds in England at that period, and very much modelled on that and the inspiration of William Morris. Warndorfer, this young banker, agreed to put up the money through his family fortune, but they wanted somebody, if you like, to be a spiritual leader. And they asked Mackintosh, and he wrote them a wonderful letter from Glasgow saying this was a great plan, terribly important, that the modern movement was the most significant force in, if you like, the elevation of humankind at the turn of the century as we looked into the 20th century from the 19th. He wrote them this wonderful letter saying, "I wish I was there to help you with a great, strong Scots shovel." And that letter and that inspiration was taken by the Wiener Werkstatt group as an instruction to go forward, because Mackintosh had blessed the venture.
Meanwhile, 1,400 miles west on the other outermost edge of Europe, the problems with Mackintosh's career at home become a bit clearer to us now. His kind of architecture was an expensive game. He only ever had a few clients, rich patrons who could indulge their passion for art and design. His clients had to be willing to give him complete creative control over their homes or businesses. It was a woman who came to his aid. Apart from Margaret, she was to be his staunchest professional ally. Catherine Cranston, doyenne of Glasgow tea room proprietors.
Tea rooms are an extraordinary feature of Glasgow. They're not perhaps what you would think of, first of all, in this city, but at the turn of the century, they were a remarkable feature of the city. It was partly a case of the temperance movement seeking to provide some alternative to pubs and heavy drinking, alcoholic drinking, so something to eat, just drinking tea, and partly also a middle-class movement for providing something for people to eat and drink who had come into the city, particularly women, middle-class women coming to shop. And the leading figure in Glasgow of this was Miss Cranston, a remarkable and extremely eccentric woman who wore clothes carefully and sustainedly, wore clothes some 30 years out of date.
She was a risk-taker in business and judged that Mackintosh could give an arresting avant-garde look to her suites of luncheon and refreshment rooms. He didn't fail her. In 21 years of tea-room work, his styles varied, but his prime achievement was the Willow tea-rooms in Sauchiehall Street, not far from the art school. There were 3 luncheon and tea rooms, and billiard and smoking rooms, plus the ladies' enclave, the Salon de Luxe. In the mirrors, the clientele could see themselves, as others did, in all their glory. Beneath the mirrors, silk on the walls, silver chairs with purple plush upholstery, slivers of delicately coloured glass spinning the light. The staff uniforms, too, were a Mackintosh production. Everything, from hat stands to teaspoons. Miss Cranston paid, and again, Mackintosh exercised total control.
Mackintosh was blessed with a few wonderful patrons, but in truth only 3. Newbury for the art school, Miss Cranston for the tea rooms and her home, and Blackie for the Hill House. Not many patrons would agree to essentially give themselves up to an architect or a designer who would create everything so completely. He was lucky in having those 3 very enlightened people gave him the opportunity to actually demonstrate what that idea of a holistic approach to architecture integrated with art and design could really look like.
This was the same perplexing Mackintosh who, in a different frame of mind, could celebrate the artistic aspirations of an enlightened man of business like Walter Blackie, the publisher. Blackie had Mackintosh design him a family home at Helensburgh on the Clyde. Mackintosh told Blackie, "Here is the house. It is not an Italian villa or English mansion house, a Swiss chalet or a Scotch castle. It is a dwelling house." And a happy home for the Blackie family, but aesthetic standards were not allowed to slip. Mackintosh politely chided Mrs. Blackie for putting yellow flowers in the hall. He said you couldn't put yellow flowers there, it ruined his colour scheme. So Mrs. Blackie placed them in the drawing room. 40 years later, Walter Blackie would remember Mackintosh's attention to detail as something quite unusual for 1904. There were cupboards and drawers in plenty, magazine racks in the ends of the long window seat. Mackintosh designed the carpets, the furniture, the fireplaces, grates, fenders, fire irons. The bathroom shower is the last word, a cage of copper pipes, like a stateroom shower on an ocean liner. Electricity, hygiene, and art. The Rosicrucian mystics, whom the Immortals had been so keen on at the Glasgow School of Art, interpreted life as an odyssey from darkness to light, from unthinkingness to moral illumination. In the buildings, corridors, close staircases, and tunnels lure us on, we're drawn towards the light. Upstairs, brighter and brighter, like a secret chamber in a fairy tale. It wasn't just architecture which the Immortals had hoped to change, or the arts, but the lives we lead. Their objective was sweetness, simplicity, freedom, confidence, and light.
The symbolic language which was developed in the watercolours of the 1890s was where the symbolism was then used in the design work and the architecture of the great years of achievement from 1896 through to about 1910. And one very good example of this, an early example, is the Argyle Street chair with the tall back. And here in this chair you get this sun disk within which there is a bird form. And below the sun and below the bird, the lines of light fall down onto the round of the earth, which you can see beneath the chair. This was a chair that Mackintosh designed for Margaret, and she sat at his table with that disc behind her.
When Mackintosh and Margaret Macdonald got married, they designed a flat, the interior of a flat, as their marital home. The thing that's extraordinary about it is that in ordinary middle-class homes at that date, there was a quite clear gender code that there were dark rooms like the dining room and the library and the study and the billiard room, which were thought of as masculine, and light rooms like the drawing room and the bedroom, which were thought of as feminine. Now, what Mackintosh and Macdonald do is to take that code and to kind of intensify it, so it becomes almost an expression of their own sexual relationship. If you stand, as I've often stood in the Mackintosh house, and listen to people, the visitors, it's a museum space, and their voices are hushed because they're in a museum. And then they come upstairs, and as they reach the top, they come into this room, which is full of light, full of veiled light, and their voices already hushed become even more hushed. And you think, what's going through their minds? Have they walked up the stairs to heaven or something? What is it? And then you watch them, and as time goes by, this spiritual atmosphere that they're experiencing so intensely fades and their normal instincts return, and you see them looking sideways for the warder, the person who's supposed to be taking care, and they wait till the warder's looking away, and they're fingering the furniture, and there's a lot of sensuality going on, and this exactly reproduces what people saw in 1900, which gives me confidence in saying that that's what Mackintosh and Macdonald put into it, a strange, virginal sexiness.
The Mackintoshes' own home was a world apart. The couple didn't have any children, not for the want of trying, and Margaret visited umpteen obstetricians. Without a family, Toshie and Margaret could take their ideas about decoration to absolute ends. But these were rooms to live in. A niece remembered a red fire glowing in the grate, tea, connoisseur blend and meringues, and at Christmas time, coloured wool wound about the chairs and cupboards, one colour for each niece or nephew, leading to a hidden present. Margaret worked at her gesso panels on the floor, wearing white kid gloves to protect her hands from the terps. Mackintosh built up the layers of paint as many as 6 coats of eggshell. The result is perfect smoothness.
I think their own home is kind of freer and fresher than other homes, and perhaps little bits of intensity, like the 2 little cushions, one for each cat. Bits of, I think what people always say in the Mackintosh house, it's a good thing they didn't have children, and what they mean is the carpet is white.
There were exhibits abroad for the Mackintoshes in these years. At Turin, more white rooms, and in Berlin, Budapest, Moscow. To Mackintosh, Glasgow seemed very dull and provincial sometimes. There was little work coming in, and over what little there was, he was no longer allowed complete control. One of his last jobs in Glasgow was Scotland Street School, where Mackintosh had to manoeuvre himself around the predetermined plans of others. He talked of the growing antagonism towards his work and the undeserved ridicule he was suffering. He admits to growing despondency and despair. He was still an outsider, not one of the boys. Word had been going about. Mackintosh didn't honour budgets or completion dates. He was stubborn, argumentative, even childish. He was fond of a drink or 2, or 3. It was true.
There are all sorts of stray stories about him, that he was often moody. There's a lot of talk about him drinking heavily, and it's absolutely clear. I remember meeting somebody who knew Mackintosh and who recalls that he was working next door to him in a studio and he could smell the drink on his breath. So there's no doubt about the drinking, but a lot has been made of the drinking which perhaps is unwarranted. Lots of people drank quite heavily at that time. Did he drink and lead into stupor, as one might think, or did he drink and design terribly well? We really don't know.
In 1900, Glasgow had been ready for a Mackintosh. He was modern, all right. He was the most stylish of the Glasgow stylists, but in time he was seen as just too individual, too challenging. All that mystical symbolism was definitely a thing of the past. Glasgow had overdosed on design. It was smart to scoff at the tea rooms now. Even some of the new generation were calling the art school queer, decadent. Mackintosh fell into a long depression, developed pneumonia. His recovery was slow. For a change of scene, in July 1914 the couple went south, to Walberswick in Suffolk, to do some painting to get their strength back. Walberswick was a welcoming haven to begin with. The pair painted in a fisherman's shed beside the sluggish River Blythe. They held small tea parties for other artists. The locals called him Mac among themselves. Mackintosh went walking in a black tweed Inverness cape and a deerstalker. His limp meant he had to lean on a stick. He would be smoking a pipe and talking to himself.
You wouldn't see Mackintosh all day, even if it was fine. But when it got dark, he'd go out for a walk. I thought he was Sherlock Holmes, the detective. I suppose that's why I followed him. Look, I was only a little boy then. Once he got past me, I started to follow him. He was going towards the beach. Anyway, I kept out of sight behind the dunes and watched him walking along the tide mark. He kept stopping and looking back, but I was sure he didn't see me. Anyway, he got right to the water's edge, and he stopped and just looked out to sea.
I remember Mr. Mackintosh, and it was in 1914, and I was only 12, and I used to come and stay with my aunt, and sort of to help her, be with her, and for the weekends at Millside. And he used to be always dressed in very dark clothes, and had sort of big, round sort of hat. And I should think he was a man about 50, I should think, yes.
Mackintosh took up botanical sketching. There was talk of a book of flower drawings for a German publisher. Letters arrived for the Mackintoshes with German and Austrian franc marks. Then Britain went to war.
And he was lodging with my aunt, and we never used to see him all day long. I think he used to be shut up in his room doing his work, but he always went out in the evening, about 7:30 time. Never knew what time he came home, and of course they suspected him to be a German spy.
The upshot was that, in fact, the military arrived, they searched his house, they found letters from Germany and Vienna, because he already had contacts with there, of an entirely innocent artistic kind, if artistic things can be innocent. And he was asked to leave the eastern counties and had to go to London.
His indignation went on smouldering inside, for months, until it was just another aspect of the man's acute dissatisfaction with the world. From Walberswick, the pair drifted up to London. They settled in Chelsea and started to revive. Mackintosh wore big bow ties, a smoking cap, held himself more erect. His hair was nearly white, though.
What one sees Mackintosh and Macdonald doing is, for much of the time, I suppose they were frustrated. They had lived in lodgings, they had a studio each in Chelsea, and almost no work coming in. But they make attempts to start in different directions. They start designing patterns for textiles. Mackintosh starts painting watercolours of flowers, rather elaborate watercolours of flowers, not like the ones he'd done earlier.
Only one new patron was forthcoming during the war years, Wenman J. Bassett Lauck, a modern-minded manufacturer of engine models and model railway locomotives. New building was out of the question in 1916, so the commission was to convert a small existing terrace house in Northampton. Bassett Lauck felt the Scotsman was on the same wavelength as himself. Mackintosh was very constricted. His brief was to provide some more living space, add a bathroom, replace the decor and furniture.
Well, the Derngate House, of course, is an enormous surprise, because those people who are familiar with the Mackintosh of the Glasgow years find it really quite a shock. Mackintosh in Glasgow was sensuous. It's very sexy architecture. Beautiful, sinuous, flowing lines that come from nature. That was the way Mackintosh made things work. It had a very beautiful kind of quality to it. And suddenly, the white on white, or white on cream and greys and browns of Glasgow disappear. And you get hard geometric shapes diamonds, zigzags, and all done with black walls and black furniture and dark blue carpets, and all incredibly predicting what Art Deco was going to do in France in the 1920s. And of course, this is 10 years before.
The guest bedroom, reconstructed in the Hunterian Art Gallery in Glasgow, shows a strong Austrian influence. George Bernard Shaw came to visit Bassett Lauk. He was asked by his host the next morning, had the room's decor interfered with his sleep? No, was Shaw's response. I always sleep with my eyes closed. Bassett Lauk had explained to Mackintosh that he was colourblind. Yellow was the only colour he could distinguish. The textiles experience was allowing Mackintosh to find a frame for the yellow. The days of white had long gone. We find it only on the exterior, at the back, where Mackintosh built on a 3-story bay, conceivably inspired by Bassett Lauk himself. It looks like Vienna or Berlin, but it's Northampton, circa 1917. This was Mackintosh's last job. In the early 1920s, from Chelsea, his glory days appeared further and further away, a kind of dream. He wasn't able to do what he wanted most of all to do, which was to put up buildings, to furnish them, to create a whole way of life inside and around them. His vision for some artist studios in Chelsea, and later a theatre, all came to nothing. Mackintosh saw little point in staying on in London, if it was just to face more indifference. Southern France, the couple decided, would be a lot cheaper than Britain, and the Scots, anyway, have a flair for exile. Mackintosh was 55, Margaret 59.
In 1923, he and Macdonald decided, I think, just to go on holiday in France, a long holiday, and they went to the south of France, where it turns round almost into Spain. And they stayed there, moving around. It's very difficult to trace exactly where they were, principally staying in the little port of Port Vendre. And there he paints.
The Pyrenees, a hotel life, trying to speak French. He painted 41 watercolours. Sea, headlands, harbours, fortresses, villages, all more or less deserted. He freely shifted rocks and buildings about to give himself the compositions he wanted. When Margaret had to go back to London to consult doctors, Mackintosh wrote to her almost every day. He was working hard at his painting, but he sounds lost without her.
There's a wonderful remark in one of Mackintosh's letters where he says, I'm sitting here by myself at the table. He reports on having eaten at the table. Margaret had gone back to London, and this was very unfamiliar to him, and he's writing all the time about how strange it is to do the things they do every day. They're spending hardly any money. He says, they put a full bottle of wine on the table, as if you were still here, but I've only drunk the half of it. And what he's saying to her is, look, please note, I'm not drinking anymore. It's all right.
I only got as far as the tamaria trees, where I sat on my 3-legged stool and tried to do 3 things: to read, to look about me, and to think. I know I did not read, I may have looked about me, and I know I thought, and particularly thought about you, wishing you were there also, even allowing for the fact that after 10 minutes you would declare that your delicate bum was not made to sit on and insist on moving on. I got back in good time and had a good lunch, a lamb cutlet and a lamb kidney. You would have enjoyed that.
Mackintosh was earning less than a navvy for his paintings, but now he could control his anger about that. So be it.
In your last letter I hear a little cry, as if you were tired of being alone. Well, Margaret, I have hated being alone all the time. Nothing is the same when you are not here. Everything has a flatness. I feel as if I was waiting for something all the time, and that is true, because I am waiting for you. Dear Margaret, it will not be long now until we meet again.
The paintings are placid. The visible is refined to a kind of design, nature redesigned, an abstract harmony. Mackintosh had transmuted his sadness into a declaration of love for Margaret, for his surroundings, for his art.
I think what we've learned from Mackintosh is an absolute belief in beauty, the significance of environments that are in themselves beautiful, fantastically crafted, beautifully designed, the significance they have on human life, that they can improve the quality of the way that your life works for you.
What you do have is constantly the celebration of Mackintosh. You have a reputation which has grown and grown and grown ever since he died, and which now, if he were to come back, it would astonish him. It would absolutely astonish him. And whether he would recognize himself, I'm not sure.
It's easy to look back at Mackintosh as the rejected genius, the master builder disowned by his own folk. It's an overstatement of what happened, but it allows each generation to try and discover Mackintosh for itself. We interpret his virtues to suit our own age. And so it is that the buildings appear perennially fresh to us, as modern as the day, as if we had just woken up to discover them there. After his 4 years in France, a lump had appeared on Toshi's tongue, so they returned to London to have it examined. The diagnosis was cancer of the tongue, all that stinging hot local tobacco. He was taken into hospital. His tongue was removed. When Mackintosh came out of hospital, he was wearing a radium collar. An old friend, the dancer Margaret Morris, found them rooms in a house in Hampstead which had a garden with a willow tree. Mackintosh sat under the tree, and it was Margaret Morris who patiently coaxed him to try speaking. He couldn't speak, and instead she sat holding his hand in the shade of the willow tree. Mackintosh died in London in December 1928. His ashes were scattered over the Mediterranean from one of those rocks he painted. Margaret Macdonald Mackintosh lived on for another 4 years. She returned for 3 months each summer to Port Vendre, to the same harbourside hotel, the Commerce, where she used to stay with Toshi. It was said of her that she never talked about her husband.